For weeks now, Toronto and other Canadian cities have been sounding the alarm about the impact the COVID pandemic is having on the bottom line. Mayor John Tory has spoken of a shortfall in the billions of dollars and major cuts if the province and feds don't step up. He joins us now this morning. Good morning, Mayor.
Hey, Mark.
So you have repeatedly said in recent days the time is up for that money to come forward. Yesterday, we heard from Premier Ford claiming he's making efforts with the feds. You've given them till Sunday, I believe you said yesterday. So what are you expecting at this point?
Well, Premier Ford has been making a real effort to get other provinces on side and to convince the federal government that they have to, meaning the provinces and the federal government, have to form some sort of partnership on this. I mean, what they've been doing, frankly, is having a bit of a staring contest, somebody called it, where they haven't yet decided who is going to bear what share of responsibility for helping cities and towns out. But the bottom line is cities and towns, including Toronto, right across Ontario and across Canada, are really struggling because they've lost a lot of revenue. In Toronto's case, just so people understand an example, the transit system is losing about $20 million plus per week because people are not using the transit to go to work because they're not going to work. So these are monies that we can't recover. I mean, they're gone. So, I guess what we're then going to have to do if we get no assistance, and I know Premier Ford is working particularly hard and Deputy Prime Minister Freeland has been helping, but what we're going to have to do is simply start to make cuts, and they're going to have to be significant cuts because our shortfall totals up to, just under $2 billion for the rest of this year. And as people out there know, watching BT, if you start to lose your income in a family budget, the longer you leave making the decisions to cut your expenditures, the deeper the cuts have to be later on, just because you have to make up the same money in a shorter time. So that's why we have to sort of know sooner than later. And we have a report coming forward very soon, this month, that starts to outline the cuts that will be made. And indeed, I think we'll have to start making them.
Now, in the past, you've talked about some of those cuts, TTC services, among other city services, perhaps some layoffs as a result. What can we expect at this point, or what can you tell us about that report that is in the works?
Well, I mean, the report simply goes through a list. It's pure mathematics. I mean, one of the biggest areas we spend money on is public transit, for example. And as much as you need public transit to move people around the city, it continues to hemorrhage money because we don't have the revenue. We already subsidize it to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars through taxes each year. If you then lose the fare box revenue, you have something that's just not sustainable. And so we've already laid off some people, I regret to say, but we would have to lay off thousands more and cut service back by a very substantial amount. We've even talked about amounts as much as 50%. So you would reduce the bus and even the subway service, because every one of those bus and subway routes that has vehicles on it costs money. You'd have to cut back on a lot of those kinds of things. And I don't want to do that because I think it's the worst possible time now as we try to recover from a terrible pandemic and people are going back to work and so on. And so the solution is for the other governments to come up with a reasonable package. And I think right now, there has been an initial offer. I would say it is one that was only a very preliminary offer made by the federal government in terms of the amount of money involved spread across all the provinces and cities. I think the provinces have responded saying they would participate in a partnership. And I think that's where Premier Ford has really been trying hard to get those two groups to come together on some kind of a formula and get on with it. And that's all that I'm asking, is that they get on with it. It's been since April that we started to outline these problems, and here we are getting into the middle of July. It's a long time, and it's late in the context of these cuts I was talking about.
On another note, you've had an encampment of protesters in Nathan Phillips Square right outside your office who were given notice last Friday, I believe, or they would be removed. So no action at this point. What can you tell us about what's going on?
Well, we've served the legal notices on them to indicate to them that there are a number of activities they're engaged in that are contrary to the law. For example, there is a law that says, for obvious reasons, I think, you cannot camp in a tent on Nathan Phillips Square. You cannot have a fire on Nathan Phillips Square. And so we've served that notice, which is a legal requirement. But what we've tried to do, because we're trying to be respectful of these groups and their right to protest, is to convince them that they should locate themselves elsewhere. They can't continue here indefinitely. We've been very patient, but, all patience runs to an end at a certain point in time, and the approach of saying that we hope you'll leave voluntarily also runs to an end. So we're continuing those discussions, but patience is running out in the context of the fact that you just can't have people indefinitely in violation of the law in a public square where, frankly, they have precluded or ended up pushing out other uses that were intended, like a farmer's market. And I'm not saying a farmer's market is more important than a protest. I am saying the people who want to run the farmer's market have every right to have a permit, which they received, to run that farmer's market. And when they're stopped from doing that by people who are camping in Nathan Phillips Square, that can't continue.
A big day today with the Toronto Police Services Board, the virtual town hall meeting that many people have been looking forward to. Council obviously voting in favor of reforms that you had put forth. That's stopping short of cutting the budget, though. That was another proposal. You're bound to hear plenty of criticism from those who have called for defunding the police and problems of systemic racism within the force. What more can be done at this point, and what are you expecting to hear?
Well, we had a meeting yesterday in my office on your question of what more can be done to actually begin the process of mapping out the reforms and changes that will be made. And the town hall is going to be a great introduction to all of that. There's going to actually be 4 of them because there was such a heavy public response that we've decided to have more than one. They're going to be virtual because of the pandemic. But I think, people are going to see we're going to move quickly on some of these things, transparency in the budget and things like that, that we can say, look, we're going to do it. And some of the more complicated issues, like how you find an alternate form of policing, especially as regards, say, people like mental health, people with suffering from mental health issues, and maybe don't have the police do that anymore. That takes a little longer to do it properly. We're also going to have to listen very carefully, as I intend to do today. I'll be at this town hall today, to the examples that will guide us in bringing about change to get rid of systemic racism, because there is no question in this city, and it's not confined to policing, but it's there. There are many examples of systemic racism that still exist in the city, and we have to deal with that and eradicate it. So that is what we're going to be listening to today, as many people who are going to express views on that. And I, by the way, fully understand and expect and anticipate that the reforms that we bring about will lead to alterations in the downward direction to the police budget. But I think the right way to go about it is decide on the change, make the change, and the budget changes will follow, as opposed to just naming some arbitrary number and saying that's the way you bring about change. To me, it's like going on a diet and saying the best way to lose 10 pounds is to take off your arm. I mean, it would achieve the purpose, but it wouldn't do it in that kind of sensible, thoughtful, rational way that you have to do in order to make sure you keep the city safe, but that you also address the issues of racism and policing that is biased.
It's obviously an important conversation to take place today and ongoing beyond that. Mayor Tory, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Mark.